Welcome, naturalists. Today I'm going to talk about mosses and liverworts. And we had a foray around the Mattole area last summer. And so I'm going to emphasize that. Most of the photos that I'm showing are from that. And we'll put together like a photo guide that'll be on the website someplace, sometime real soon, like not right away, but you get the idea. Okay, so mosses and liverworts, along with hornworts, are called bryophytes. And I think we should start by figuring out what a bryophyte is. So a bryophyte is a land plant that's not a vascular plant. Most of the plants that you know that are land plants are vascular plants, like conifers, ferns, flowering plants, and so on. All the rest we would call bryophytes. As land plants, they have a certain kind of life cycle, which I'll get into eventually. They photosynthesize in a certain way, and they are, in a general way, able to handle not being constantly in the water. So here's one possible way that the four groups of land plants might be related to one another. That is, there might be liverworts, mosses, hornworts, and then out of that group arose the vascular plants, the more familiar vascular plants. Or it might be the other way around, where the vascular plants diverge first, and liverworts, mosses, and hornworts are all each other's closest relatives. This is a super hard problem to figure out because the four lineages were established, 450 million years ago. And there's not a lot of clues left. So let's mention liverworts. There's maybe 7,000 species worldwide and encompasses some very disparate plants. So it's pretty hard to say what a liverwort looks like. You can learn what complex thallus liverworts are and leafy liverworts and so on. This is a simple thallus liverwort, and this part that sort of looks like a rice noodle, that's the sporophyte. It's the part that makes spores. So sporophytes make spores, and they're made inside of this little capsule here. The sporophyte lives out its whole life attached to the gametophyte, which does most of the photosynthesizing and claims ground, so occupies space on substrate. Gametophytes are plants that make gametes, eggs and sperm, and sporophytes are plants that make spores. And there's this alternation of generations between the gametophyte and the sporophyte. And then here's a picture of some moss. So there's maybe 14,000 species of moss worldwide. And again, you have sporophytes and gametophytes. So the gametes make egg and sperm. And then the sporophytes make spores. And the sporophytes in mosses are quite substantial compared to in liverworts. In liverworts, you have that rice noodle thing, and it only lasts for a few days. Whereas in mosses, the sporophyte, you can see it for a year after it's dispersed its spores. And then I should also mention hornworts, much, much smaller group, not very many species, maybe only 150 worldwide. The sporophytes look maybe vaguely like a blade of grass, and they arise from a gametophyte. There's a couple things that are noteworthy about hornworts. One is that they typically only have one chloroplast per cell. So, if you find it without the sporophyte, you might wonder, what is this thing? If you could look at it through a microscope, you would notice that it only had one chloroplast per cell, and very, very few other things have that. Also, they tend to have a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria, that is blue-green algae. And so they perhaps have a slightly different cast, a little bit bluer cast than a liverwort would, or say a fern gametophyte. Anyway, I won't have much to say about them because, well, I have to keep it down. And then vascular plants are the fourth big group. That's the one that people know, I guess, because the plants are big. And so here we have a fern. That's a nice example of a vascular plant. The gametophytes are these things here. And then they make eggs and sperm. And when the eggs and sperm get together, they grow into be a sporophyte. And then in ferns, and typically in all vascular plants, the sporophyte grows and grows and becomes much bigger than the gametophyte. It puts down roots and takes on an independent existence separate from the gametophyte, unlike in liverworts and mosses. Okay, so we might sort of start out here with a couple differences between bryophytes and vasculars. One is that vascular plants have very elaborate vascular tissue, including lignin, which is the chemical that makes wood hard. Vascular plants, they send roots down into the ground. There's a way in which they absorb water. They conduct that water up the plant to the leaves, and then the water is transpired. They also have a fairly elaborate system for piping around sugars, where sugars are made in the leaves and then piped down to the roots. Whereas bryophytes, they have some vascular tissue. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's much less than in vascular plants. And that's generally not their way of making a living, by piping stuff around. Then there's this other big difference, and that is in vascular plants, the sporophyte, we could say, is dominant. It grows off of the gametophyte and takes on its own independent life. There are a few ferns in which the gametophytes reproduce on their own and have large ranges, and the sporophyte has a small range, so it only sexually reproduces in part of its range. But for the most part, vascular plants, what you see and notice and appreciate is the sporophyte, the spore-producing plant. Whereas in bryophytes, most of what you appreciate and see and what's ecologically important is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte lives out its life entirely on the gametophyte, attached to the gametophyte. So it doesn't occupy space on its own. So let's go through the life cycles of a typical moss and a typical fern. So here we have a typical moss, and yeah, we'll start here. So spores are dispersed. They are released into the air column, and then they waft around. And in most mosses, the spores are, let's say, almost immortal. They live for a long time. They can go places. They can be in places that are not so great. And then if they find themselves in an appropriate spot, they can germinate. So they're very lucky mosses that end up in an appropriate spot, germinate, and then they typically, in most mosses, grow this filamentous stage, a juvenile stage. And then buds will form on this juvenile stage and grow up to be the leafy part of the moss that we think of as a moss. In lots and lots of species, the sexes are separate. So you'll have a female plant, and then you'll have another spore that makes a male plant. And then there's other species in which the sexes are combined. They're co-sexual, and you have both male and female parts on the same plant. Okay, so in this species, we have separate sexes, and this is a male plant. And if we blow up this part and look at it more carefully, then you'll see inside these little sausage-shaped jobs. And those little sausage-shaped jobs make sperm. So I think the way it works, I mean, this is sort of a generalization, but at least in some cases, the way it works is the sausage makes the sperm and it holds it inside, and then the moss dries out. And then at some point, the moss gets wet again, and that's kind of its signal to squirt its sperm out. And then meanwhile, there's female plants, and if we blow up this little tip of the female plant, then you can see another cluster, and this has a cluster of female organs, and inside of each female organ there's an egg. So the egg sends a chemical signal out into the environment saying, "Come to me, you little sperm." And the sperm are then attracted to the egg, and the miracle of life happens. So this sperm here combines with this egg here, and we end up with the first cell that has a genetic contribution from both the male dad and the female mom. And that first cell, called a zygote, divides and divides and grows up to be a sporophyte. So here we can see the mother gametophyte, and it has a sporophyte growing on top of it. The tissue right here is called a placenta, by analogy. And then it eventually makes a capsule, and then the capsule produces eggs, produces spores. The capsule produces spores that dehiss on the wind. So that's the life cycle. And I think it's a great thing to learn. It kind of influences the biology in so many ways. Let's look at a fern by contrast. So here we have a fern capsule that's dispersing its spores. They blow in the wind. Most fern spores are also almost immortal, and they fly all over the place. And if a spore lands in a place that's appropriate, a very lucky spore lands in a place that's appropriate, it'll grow up to be a gametophyte. Here's a gametophyte here. And this particular gametophyte, as in most ferns, has the potential to make both sperm and egg. So right here, it has female organs, and those female organs produce an egg, each one. And then right here, there are male organs, and those male organs produce sperm. And then they are attracted to the egg, and you end up with a fertilized zygote again. That zygote divides and divides, and that embryo then grows up to be a sporophyte. Like here's the first leaf of the sporophyte. And eventually that sporophyte will grow roots and overtake the gametophyte entirely. And, that's the fern that we notice most of the time. Okay, so it's time to learn some mosses. So these are some mosses that we saw on our gathering at the Mattole Camp and Retreat Center. And these are the mosses that I'm going to put in the handout that'll eventually make its way to the lab, to the website. Okay, so let's start with Orthodricum rivulare. Orthodricum rivulare grows on the rocks along the edge of the river. So it's probably flooded right now, or at least it was a couple of weeks ago. If you looked at it with a hand lens, you could see the edge of the leaf has these teeth that are kind of irregular. Also, this part here, this kind of hood that covers the capsule, is quite large. And then here's a fairly close relative. This is Pelvigera. It grows on twigs of broadleaf trees like oaks and madrones, maples, kind of high up, but it has much narrower leaves. Again, the hood is pretty big in this in this moss and Pelvigira. And you can take two species and connect them like this and say they're related to one another. You can do that with any two species. Like two species are related to each other. And if you go back far enough in time, they share a common ancestor that gave rise to both of them. So I've done that here. And this, in a minute, this will become clever, I think. Okay, so moving right along. This is Necra douglasii. The leaves are a little bit undulate. You can notice that if you really look closely or use a hand lens. It lives on the branches and trunks of broadleaf trees, so the same places that Pelvigira lives, but probably not quite the same diameter on average. You can find them right next to each other, that's true, but just, there's some difference in their distributions, and it's a little bit more in towards the trunk or large branches. So that's Necra douglasii. And then this is Metanecra menziesii. It also has the undulations on the leaves, and I would say that this is very much on trunks. So it's even farther towards the center of the tree than Necra douglasii. So already I've said, like if we looked at a maple tree, at the tips you would find Pelvigira, on the big branches you'd find Necra, and on the trunks you'd find Metanecra. Metanecra and Necra are related to each other fairly closely, and so I've again drawn lines showing that they descended from a common ancestor. And then it turns out we need data, but I'm quite sure that the data indicate that this is the relationship, that a long, long time ago, you had an ancestor that gave rise to both Necra and Metanecra and to Orthotrichum and Pelvigira. And then subsequently, you had on this lineage an ancestor that gave rise to Pelvigira and Orthotrichum. And on this lineage, we have an ancestor that gave rise to Necra and Metanecra. Moving right along, this is Pseudisothecium cristatum. And typically, I find this on Douglas fir, kind of near the base, the trunk and the base. Also stumps of Douglas fir on the bark. And yeah, you notice this species because the leaves clasp the shoot in such a way that it makes the whole thing look kind of like a cylinder or a worm, as opposed to other species of Pseudisothecium. And then here's another moss. This is a moss that, like, if you were going to learn just one moss, you could walk around the forest and say, oh, look, that's Kinbergia oregana. And if it was on the forest floor around here and it kind of looks like a feather moss, that's probably what it is. There's a lot of feather mosses, lots and lots of species of feather mosses, but they kind of drop out as you descend in latitude on the West Coast. And so most of them are gone by the time you get to Mattole. And this is one that's not. It's still there. So it's kind of the last of the feather mosses as you're moving south and covers the forest floor. It's reasonably closely related to Pseudisothecium, and so we draw the line that way. And then this is the way I think they're related to one another. So Necra and Metanecra are related to one another. Pseudisothecium and Kinbergia are related to one another. And the four of them, along with many, many, many other mosses, are in this big branch on the tree of life called the pleurocarpy. The pleurocarpy arose before the flowering plants, but during the radiation of the flowering plants during the Cretaceous, the flowering plants kind of took over the land, and the pleurocarpy radiated along with them. So it seems like maybe the climate changed, flowering plants came into their own. They formed these great forests, and then you got lots and lots of other organisms that radiated in many different forms living in these forests. And for mosses, the pleurocarpi are the ones that did this.
And we have a question in the chat before you move on,
Yeah,
Paul. Elliot asks, how long did bryophytes have before ferns came along?
not long. Um, so both of them were established like 400 million years ago. And then we have, yeah, let's just say, close to 300 million years of time while ferns are doing their thing and mosses are doing their thing. And then like 100 million years ago, you have this radiation of the flowering plants. That's, let's just say in the heyday of dinosaurs during the Cretaceous. And so a group of ferns radiated in the shadow of angiosperms, in the shadow of flowering plants. They're called the polypoid ferns. And most of the ferns, almost all the ferns that naturally live in Humboldt County are polypoid ferns. And then the pleurocarpi also radiated in the shadow of angiosperms during the Cretaceous. There's also a group of liverworts we'll get to that did that.
And before you go on, there was also one more question in the chat that I may need Brian to clarify on, but he asked at Mount Shasta at 8,000 feet, is that likely the same species that we would find around here? And he's speaking about a moss specifically. Um,
Not too likely. There are some species that span that great of an elevational range, but they raise some eyebrows. So, for instance, there's a moss called Polytrichum pileferum that goes from sea level up to 12,000 feet. And, I'd be willing to bet something. I'd be willing to bet Brian a dinner that if you could somehow do a study, you would find that the high elevation ones can't live down low and the low elevation ones can't live up high. So I just think that they're like cryptic species. Um, yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on. So that's what we've got so far. And I'll just put that triangle there to represent that there's lots of pleurocarpi. Um, and then I'm going to move on. Now, this is a plant that grows on soil banks. It's called Epipterygium biarrhytum. It's a relatively new name for us locals. We used to call it something else, but it's been split up into various species, and the old name only applies to the species that lives, I think, in the Caribbean, and so ours gets a new name. And then I kind of solely threw away the specimen of this, so I really don't know what it is, but it looks a lot like a Ticostemum, and nobody else is going to be able to contradict me, I hope. It lives on soil and crevices between rocks and things like that. And so Epipterygium and Ticostemum are closely related in this group that we'll call the Bryales. And that is more distantly related than any of the other mosses that I've talked about so far. Here's a moss that is dear to my heart. I took bryology from Howard Crumb, and this moss is named after Howard Crumb. It's Crummia latifolia. It grows in calcareous seeps, which in Mattole is kind of along the rivers, but also could be in, it doesn't have to be next to a river. It just needs water close to 365 days a year. And then here's a big contrasting life history. This is Pleuriddium, and it grows on bare soil. So if you head out beyond Strawberry Rock and, like whatever, these big pastures. There's lots of cows and stuff. And the cows cause a little bit of disturbance, not a lot, but just a little bit. Then where they have disturbed the soil a little bit, the next winter, you get these plants that are more or less annuals. They grow up and they produce their capsules, and they go from nothing to everything in 6 months during the rainy season. And then they get smashed apart and spread out. So Pleuridum has like a very different life cycle than almost all the mosses I've talked about so far. And then this one is also a very darling little plant, Physidens grandifrons. It grows in streams over calcareous parent rock. It's very widespread, but you kind of need exactly the right geology and nice clean water to get it. So you don't find that much of it in Piercy, I think, because the streams are not calcareous enough. But the little streams that flow into the Mattole are marine uplifted, and many of them are pretty calcareous, and so you can find really nice Physidens grandifrons there. And these three are closely related to each other. Well, anyway, they're part of a big radiation. And that big radiation is called the Haplolipidi. So here we go, Haplolipidi. It includes, it's hard to exactly say, what it is, but there's a key character that all of them have in the way that they disperse their spores. And that's, vaguely interesting to hyper specialists. But I think that maybe the better thing to think about it is that the Haplolipidi include a very wide range of ecologically different types of mosses. Like the pleurocarpi, they're like, let's be in humid forests or something like that in the shade. Most desert mosses are in the Haplolipidi. There's here's another kind of strange place for a moss, the hot tropics, down low elevation in the tropics. If you see a moss, it's probably a Haplolipidi, because all these other mosses, they can't stand being hot and wet at the same time. Okay, so then I've made a little cartoon of that. We've got two great big radiations to take care of, and then pay attention to the Bryales and the Orthotrachales. And now I'm backing out away from your sort of standard moss. So I've seen very few Buxbaumia in Humboldt County in my life, like only a couple before this last summer. And yet at our little convention that we had, Mattole Camp and Retreat Center, we found what seemed to be two species of Buxbaumia. I identified this one as Buxbaumia piperi, and it was living on soil with liverworts. We found a couple occurrences of this. The one that I saw was on the way to King Peak. And then in Humboldt Redwood State Park, we saw this one, Buxbaumia viridis, on rotten wood. You can see that the skin of it's starting to blister and come off. That's typical of Buxbaumia viridis. Could be piperi, but they look different. We didn't collect it because we were in state park, so who knows, but it was kind of impressive. Now, both of these Buxbaumias, they have these great big sporophytes and not much in the way of gametophyte, at least not at the time that they have the sporophytes. And so it's been a little bit of a mystery. How do they make a living? How does this gametophyte have enough energy to get that sporophyte going? The sporophyte does photosynthesize some itself, but it's kind of bulky. It's not leafy. And so probably it's getting some sugars from mom. And mom is mostly green fuzz or little fuzzy things. That is, there's a persistent juvenile stage that is in Buxbaumia, there's a stage that in other mosses we would say was the juvenile stage. And it covers these logs and does some photosynthesizing and then somehow magically stores the sugars up until it's ready to reproduce. And it then feeds this gigantic baby. So that's kind of the lead hypothesis. And then another hypothesis that's not mutually exclusive is that maybe somehow the Buxbaumia is hooked into a fungus or something and is getting energy from some other organism. It's living on organic matter, so maybe it's somehow, maybe indirectly eating that organic matter. We don't really know. But they're definitely weird mosses. And of course, these two are related to each other. And oh no, what am I doing? I'm going the wrong direction. Well, you get the idea. Okay, so Buxbaumia then is more distantly related than any of these normal mosses that I've told you about. And then here's another moss that's even more distantly related. This is Atricum selwynii. It grows on soil banks throughout Humboldt County. A lot of skid roads made a lot of habitat for Atricum selwynii. And that's its position. Okay, so I only have one more moss to show you before we get back into liverworts. This is one that in Humboldt County typically grows on the cut ends of rotten redwood logs. It'll grow on the side of a rotten redwood log too. And then as you move farther north, it grows on lots of rotten logs like western red cedar. Let's see. So it's Tetraphis pellucida. It has little asexual propagules at the tips of its branches. It's kind of got broad leaves. It's a nice moss though, and a lot of people are excited when they get to see this, even though it's maybe passe for us in the redwood forest, because it's one of these weird wonders, distantly related from the other mosses. It would be like if you were into ferns and you got to see a tree fern or something like that. And so we'll put it there. And I call all of these mosses the odontocarpi, the mosses that have peristomes. And so here's the tree as we built it. There's mosses there, and then somehow or other they're related to liverworts. And we'll get back to that liverwort stuff. So anyway, that was like the handout that's going to be on the website. And then let's backtrack and kind of like fill in some of the bits here. So I think it's helpful to point out some of the parts of the moss. And we'll start with the sporophytes. So there's a capsule. And then the capsule is on a stalk. The stalk's called a seta. There's also a little hood on top of the capsule called the calyptra. And the calyptra, yeah, this is like a question I would ask my students, is like, is the calyptra gametophyte or sporophyte? You might think it's the sporophyte because it's on top of the capsule, but no, it's part of the gametophyte. If you can remember back to that life cycle, the egg was inside of a flask-like structure. And that flask-like structure, it grows into the calyptra. So this is maternal tissue that's on top of the baby. All right. And then if we got rid of the calyptra, then underneath the calyptra, you can see an operculum. That's the lid. And then underneath the operculum, after it pops off, you can see a peristome. Peristome is like perimeter and of the mouth, around the perimeter of the mouth. There's teeth. And these teeth open and close, dispersing the spores. Here's a bunch of pictures of peristomes. They're very different in different groups. So let's see, Grimmia, that's a haplolipidi, whereas Scleropodium, that's a pleurocarpy. Physidens, that's a haplopity. Centrichia, haplolipidi. But what these peristome teeth do is they tend to flex in and out or twist as there's changes in humidity. And so they reach in and grab spores and then pull them out and shed them into the air column. Here's a couple words worth knowing. So I've talked about the pleurocarpy, and pleurocarpy are characterized by being pleurocarpous. And what that means is that the sporophytes are borne on the sides of the main stems. They're actually borne on very short lateral stems. And it turns out that really only the pleurocarpy are truly pleurocarpous. And then all the other mosses are more or less acrocarpous. That is, they have their sporophytes borne at the tips of their growing shoots, which at least temporarily uses up that growing shoot. And so that shoot can't branch until it's kind of done reproducing. And then it can make an innovation, which is a shoot that grows, a branch that grows on the side. Whereas the pleurocarpy can keep on branching as they're producing sporophytes. Okay, we'll continue on with liverworts in the same vein, like what are the parts of a liverwort? And like I said, it's a little bit hard because there's so many kinds of liverworts. I think liverworts were named after this kind of liverwort, Connocephalum. This is a complex thallus liverwort. And what that means is if you took the gametophyte and made a section through it, you'd get a picture like the one on the left, where there's a surface layer, and then underneath the surface layer, there's a photosynthetic layer, and there's air pores that allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to get into the photosynthetic layer. And that carbon dioxide can be fixed and turned into sugars. There's also some other layers underneath that seem to be not very photosynthetic. It's a complex thallus liverwort. And this one's Connocephalum, which you might find in streams, little streams, not rivers. And then here's Fossambronia. Here's some sporophytes, and you can see the capsules are those black spheres, and they're on a watery stalk. Looks like a glass noodle. And then the gametophytes look like, I don't know, Boston leaf lettuce or something like that. And then here are a couple of leafy liverworts. So leafy liverworts, you might mistake for mosses. I don't think I would, not normally, and I'm not sure why. It's not because of what I'm going to tell you. It's just I have a feeling. So here's some things that I'll tell you. If the leaves are in 2 or 3 ranks, it's probably a leafy liverwort, whereas if the leaves are spirally arranged, it's probably a moss. There are exceptions. There are definitely mosses that have 2 ranks of leaves. If it has a midrib, it's probably a moss, but there's lots and lots of mosses that don't have midribs. And there are a few liverworts that you could maybe think that they have something like a midrib. If it has rounded lobes, that's a little bit of a suggestion that it's a liverwort. Most mosses have pointed leaves, but there's a fair number of liverworts where the leaves are so lobed and each lobe has a that you wouldn't notice that they were one leaf, and each lobe is pointed. So that's not perfect either. But if you've got a sporophyte and it looks like a glass noodle, it's not a moss. It's just that you often don't have a sporophyte. So that's a problem. This sporophyte opens by 4 longitudinal slits like this and sheds its spores to the wind. Okay, now we're back to the handout. So here's some liverworts to learn. Here's Radula complanata, which grows on bark of, like a young tree, or I think tall up on bigger trees too. You can find it on an alder, for instance. The reason why it's called radula is because the parts that give rise to the sporophytes are shaped like a chisel, and that is reminiscent of the chisel inside of the mouth of a mollusk, which is called a radula. And then here's Frulania nisqualensis. There's some other Frulanias around, so don't worry about the species too much. Genera are the nice thing to learn. And these ones are quite small and kind of coppery colored or something like that. Bronze colored, maybe you'd say. There's loads and loads of these living all over the Lost Coast. And then here's Porella navicularis. There's also several species of Porella around, so I would just focus on the genus. You can see a sporophyte here. And these three are representative of a group of liverworts that radiated in the shadow of angiosperms during the times of the dinosaurs. In contrast, this is Plagiocula porelloides. It grows on rocks kind of along the river, or at least in pretty wet places, pretty humid places. And that's not one of these ones that radiated in the shadow of angiosperms. So the group that is associated with the angiosperm radiation are called the porelline leafies, after Porella. And the ones that stayed on the ground are known as the younger Manniine leafies. I think I showed you younger Manny a while ago. If anybody's keeping track of all of these names. Those are the two big branches of leafy liverworts, and they probably got their leaves separately from mosses. And then if we move outward of those two groups, then you get something like Fossambronia. This is the one that I said looked like Boston leaf lettuce. And you get something like Pellia niceana. Both of these are simple thallus liverworts. That is, they don't have that complex stratification of tissues. And this is the way they're arranged. They're not each other's closest relatives. They're kind of like a bunch of different simple thallus liverworts were living back in the day, back in here. And then out of that simple thallus liverwort group arose these leafy liverworts. And then farther out, you get the complex thallus liverwort. So here's Mannia gracilis. I took this picture at Mattole Camp and Retreat Center. There's also a little bit of hornwort in here. And there's some moss in there too. But the charismatic plant is a complex thallus liverwort. And in Mediterranean climates, you find a lot of complex thallus liverworts. It's kind of a cool thing. I would say that leafy liverworts are not very friendly to Mediterranean climates. Okay, so there's the evolutionary tree. Again, these are the ones that were radiated in the shadow of angiosperms, and then you have a whole bunch of groups that are simple thallus liverworts. If you go back far enough, you get the common ancestor of the complex thallus liverworts and most of the ones we're talking about. And then there's a bunch of other things in there that we don't have to worry about in Humboldt County. Here is something that's kind of fun to worry about. If you remember, there was a moss I talked about 30 minutes ago that lives in the footprints of cows. And here's another plant that also lives on disturbed soil. It's more or less an annual. This is Spherocarpus. You would find this in agricultural fields, or I took this picture right out of the College of the Redwoods building. The students walk on it all the time. And they're maybe related vaguely to complex thallus liverworts. Okay, and then again, there's these four groups: the mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts, and there's a picture of a hornwort, and the vasculars. And now I want to fill out my table more. So we could say mosses are from Mars and vascular plants are from Venus. They just have very different biologies. So I already talked about how mosses have minimal vasculature, and most of this would apply to liverworts too. Whereas vascular plants have elaborate vascular tissue. Mosses tend to be small, probably because they don't have lignin. They have a hard time holding themselves up. You couldn't get a moss the size of a redwood tree unless it was on the ground. Whereas vascular plants, they could be small. Some of them are small, but many of them are large, so they're potentially large. Then the typical situation in vascular plants is they're homeohydric. That is, they control their hydration. They do a lot to keep the insides from becoming completely dried out. Like a cactus is not dried out if it's alive. It's just very, very good at keeping from becoming dried out. Whereas most mosses and liverworts are poikilohydric. They follow the hydration of the environment. So when the environment dries out during the summer, they dry out and they go to sleep. They're drought tolerant. And they recover quickly, kind of amazingly quickly from drying. Like there's the mosses where you can dump water on them and they're making more photosynthate than they're respiring after just 30 minutes. Some of them take longer, but in general, mosses and liverworts are drought tolerant and desiccation tolerant, I should maybe say, and recover quickly. Whereas vasculars, even the ones that are drought tolerant, it takes them quite a while to repair themselves and their tissues. In vascular plants, I guess you'd say that the root hairs are where everything's happening. That, and they're also usually tied into a fungus, and so it's really mycorrhizae where everything's happening. The fungus and the root hairs, the little fine tips of the roots. And that's all underground, and then they're piping the good stuff up. Whereas in mosses and liverworts, the surface of those leaves is biologically active. Most of the cells have access directly to any film of water that's on them. And they are very good at absorbing ionic nutrients. When I was an undergrad, there was a graduate student, Ken, can't remember his last name right now, who did his thesis on King Peak, measuring how much of the mosses were absorbing the nutrients. Now, because of this, because they're small, because they are, you can see what they're doing, gathering stuff. It's not like they're piping stuff in. Then the whole plant is kind of in one place. And I think because of that, we think of mosses and liverworts as having highly apparent niches. you can sort of see how they differ in how much they dry out, or how shady they live, or the angle of incline. All these things is just super obvious for mosses. Whereas for vascular plants, often it's hard to tell because a lot of the niche is below ground. And also, a lot of the niche is having to do with when that plant was first established, which was by an organism that was very different than the adult organism. That's true in mosses, but not nearly as much so. Also, vascular plants have limited asexual reproduction. They are specialized organs in some vascular plants that reproduce asexually. But for mosses and liverworts, almost any piece could grow on to make a new gametophyte. And researchers, the way that they grow moss, they just take moss, put it in a coffee grinder. You get a lot of fragments, and then you sew those fragments on top of I don't know, like buttermilk or something, to get them going. So almost any fragment could grow into a new moss or a new liverwort. Here's some pictures about this table that I just went through. So bryophytes tend to be small with exceptions. Here's maybe the biggest moss. Yeah, let's just call it the biggest moss. It's called Dawsonia. It lives in near the equator. And then here's a picture where I'm trying to capture the idea that the surfaces of the bryophytes interact directly with the film of water that's on them. So this was just taken with my camera, the same as most of the rest of the pictures, but you can see the individual cells in Hookeria lucens. And I think it, kind of captures the whole idea here. There's not a waxy surface that's covering the leaf like it would be in a pine tree. Here's Olecomnium. It has these little granules that are made into a pom-pom-like structure. And every one of these little granules can go off and make more Olecomnium. They often cover the log. And then once they've covered the log, then they switch over to sexual reproduction. So when you see the spores, it's usually because they've kind of used up their habitat. When you see sporophytes. Here's a couple other examples of asexual reproduction that's specialized. So here's Orthodicranum, and the tips of the leaves break off. And then Calipagia has pom-pom-like things. That's a liverwort. So both liverworts and mosses can have asexual reproductive structures that are specialized. Yeah, so the spores, they tend to be able to live a long, long time and suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And they're tiny. They can blow all over the place, even from continent to continent. And so I think there's kind of a neat little simile here that you can make about the geographic ranges. I think that mosses are to seed plants as birds are to salamanders. And as birds fly around, they tend to have large ranges. Of course, there's some birds that are specialized, but it's not that they couldn't get someplace. It's just that they are not able to live there because the niche is not right. Whereas if you look at salamanders, all you have to do is move to the other side of a valley and you get another species of salamander. And that's true of some seed plants too. A lot of seed plants have loads and loads of species that are kind of geographically defined, whereas mosses, not so much. Yes, of course, there's moss divergence that's due to geography, but there's plenty of mosses where the same species lives in the same type of climate in California and in Spain. How about aliens? Yeah, we have some aliens. So here's Campylobus enterflexus. And when I was a wee lad in southern Humboldt County, this was essentially unknown plant. the only places it was known from were places in around Humboldt Bay and obviously um, industrial type situations. Uh, and then now it's everywhere. It's like completely covered the stabilized dunes, and it's a very highly invasive moss from the southern hemisphere, and that's happened in, well, I would say it's been 50 years since it was rare, but I think 20 years ago it was already happened. It had already happened. So it happened in the space of time between 1980 and I don't know 2010 maybe. How are we doing on time here? No, look at my watch. Seven
We're just
o'clock.
at 7 o'clock right now.
Yeah, so I could stop here if you want. I was just going to show you a map of various places you can look for bryophytes around the atoll.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you want to do it? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll blast through it. Okay, so here's Mill Creek on the road out to Matoll Beach. There's a beautiful trail system there. Lots and lots of great bryophytes on that north-facing slope. If you go out to Matoll Beach, then there's maybe 6 species that are especially kind of adapted to the dunes. It's not very many, but they're different. So, I'd take a look at those. If you go up to Strawberry Rock or any of these rocks that are in the middle of pastures, walk around the rock and try to find shady spots, and you'll find a whole bunch of bryophytes. Here's a gallery forest right along the Matoll River. It gets flooded every year, but up on those trees on the trunks, you can find lots of cool mosses. And then this is the road out of Petrolia as you're going north. There's a grade, and right before you get up to the top of the grade and then dip back down to the coast, there's a rock wall there. It's just covered with cool stuff. Just don't get run over. And then going south, if you can find some places where there's deciduous oaks, you find some, additional species. And a good introduction to that is the honeydew day use area. But there's lots of other areas in there. It's just, be careful because it's private land. And then kind of hiking into the BLM area, this is Bear Creek. And it's a beautiful creek. It's like not destroyed by erosion. There's loads and loads of bryophytes in the water there. Yeah, and that's it. That's all I have to say.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.